Charlotte Madison had never apologized to anyone on the streets of New York until the morning her Bentley rear-ended a battered old coupe driven by a single father named Mason Carter. She stepped out without hesitation, checkbook already in hand, fully prepared to close the matter with money and move on with her day. But when Mason popped the trunk of that ancient Aston Martin DB5, Charlotte went utterly still. There was no spare tire inside. No forgotten luggage. What she saw instead, a concealed radar array, biometric locks, encrypted displays, and a set of defense systems stopped her cold. Stay with this story to the very end, because what Mason Carter is hiding will completely change how you see him. The morning had started the way most mornings did for Charlotte Madison, precisely, efficiently, and entirely on her own terms. Her schedule on that Tuesday in October had been locked in for 3 weeks, a 9 o'clock review with her legal team, a 10:30 walkthrough of the demo floor, and a noon signing ceremony that would formalize a partnership worth $1.4 billion with 3 of the country's largest automotive manufacturers. Charlotte ran Meridian Dynamics, one of the most aggressively innovative autonomous vehicle companies in the country, and she had built it from a single ambitious patent into a corporate empire in just under 9 years. She was 37 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and allergic to wasted time. Nothing about that morning was supposed to go wrong. Her driver, a quiet man named Gerald who had worked for her for 6 years, was threading the Bentley through Midtown Manhattan when a delivery truck drifted across 2 lanes near 48th Street without signaling. Gerald swerved to avoid a collision, which sent the rear quarter panel of the Bentley sweeping hard into the driver's side of a pearl gray Aston Martin DB5 parked along the curb. The sound was a short, ugly shriek of metal on metal, the kind that turns heads on a New York sidewalk even among people who have decided not to care. Charlotte felt the impact in her spine before she registered what had happened. Gerald was already apologizing. Charlotte was already unbuckling her seatbelt. She stepped out of the Bentley with the practiced calm of someone who handles crises for a living, and her first impression of the situation was that it was manageable. The old Aston Martin was visibly dented along the door panel and the rear quarter, but the car itself appeared to be a relic, pearl gray paint weathered to something closer to chalk, chrome trim that had dulled to the color of old coins, rubber seals around the windows beginning to separate. It was the kind of vehicle that belonged in a junkyard or, at most, a sentimental man's garage. She pulled a business card from the inside pocket of her blazer and was already composing a figure in her head. Whatever the car was worth on paper, plus 20% for inconvenience, plus a car service voucher to smooth the rest. Mason Carter appeared from the steps of a nearby brownstone, his daughter, a girl of about 8 or 9 years old, trailing beside him with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He was tall, unhurried, dressed in a charcoal canvas jacket over a plain gray shirt, the kind of man who moved through the world without making announcements. He looked at the damage on the DB5 with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't distress. It was something closer to assessment, the cool focus of a professional cataloging a problem. He asked his daughter to wait on the steps, and the girl sat down without argument, which told Charlotte something about the man's quiet authority. Charlotte introduced herself and presented her card. She explained, in the brisk, courteous tone she used with contractors and vendors, that she would cover all repair costs and any inconvenience. She named a figure. Mason didn't look at the card. He walked slowly around the rear of the DB5, crouching briefly to look at the deformation along the door seam, pressing one thumb against the crumpled panel, as though measuring something invisible. Then he stood and said, calmly, that he needed to check the car's systems before anything else. Charlotte said that was fine, assuming he meant the engine or perhaps a tire. She checked her watch. She had 47 minutes before her legal team meeting. What Mason did next was not fine, in the sense that it was entirely outside anything Charlotte had prepared for. He reached through the driver's side window and touched a section of the dashboard that appeared, to anyone watching, to be decorative trim, a strip of brushed aluminum between the instrument cluster and the glove box. He pressed it in a sequence, 3 short taps followed by 1 long press, and the interior of the car transformed. A soft blue light activated beneath the dash. The rearview mirror split along a hidden seam and folded open to reveal a compact display screen. A low hum began somewhere under the chassis, steady and purposeful. The car had woken up. Charlotte stood very still on the sidewalk and felt the world she thought she understood become, in the space of about 4 seconds, considerably more complicated. The system running through that battered Aston Martin was performing a post-impact diagnostic. Charlotte could see it clearly on the mirror display, scanning the chassis for sensor damage, checking signal integrity across multiple encrypted channels, confirming that no external devices had been attached to the vehicle during the incident. She recognized the architecture. Not the exact code, not the precise hardware, but the philosophy behind it, the layered approach to vehicular security, the way the system treated the car itself as both an asset and an intelligence node. She had seen something very close to this before, inside a locked server room in her own company, in a prototype file that had gone missing 8 months ago. Charlotte was not someone who rattled easily. She had faced hostile takeover bids, regulatory investigations, and one very public product failure that had cost her a major government contract and nearly taken the company down with it. She had emerged from each of those situations colder, sharper, and more certain of her ability to control outcomes. But standing on 48th Street watching a dashboard display in a vintage coupe run security protocols she had never expected to see outside a classified development environment, she felt something she almost didn't recognize, the early signal of being genuinely out of her depth. She asked Mason directly where he had obtained the system. Her voice was level, professional, with just enough edge to communicate that this was not a casual question. Mason closed the driver's side door and looked at her for a moment before answering. He said the car had belonged to a project he had worked on a long time ago, that it wasn't something he talked about, and that it wasn't relevant to the accident. Charlotte told him it was very relevant to her. He didn't argue. He simply said that some parts of a person's past were better left undisturbed, and that if she had questions about her own company's security architecture, she might want to start closer to home. That last sentence landed with the precision of a key turning in a lock. Charlotte studied his face, no trace of threat. No posturing, no attempt to leverage the moment. He said it the way a doctor states a diagnosis, without drama, because drama changes nothing. She told him she needed to know his full name. He told her it was Mason Carter. She told him she was going to have her team run a background check. He said that was her right, and that she wouldn't find much. He was correct. By the time Charlotte was back in the Bentley and her assistant had run the search, what came back was sparse enough to be remarkable in itself. Mason Carter, 42 years old, licensed mechanical and systems engineer, no current corporate affiliations, a single published patent from 11 years ago in the field of vehicular electromagnetic shielding, and then, nothing. No employment records after a certain date, no professional registrations, no conference appearances, no industry mentions. He existed in the public record the way someone exists who has worked very hard to stop existing in the public record. Charlotte had seen that pattern before, in people who had either done something they were hiding or survived something they were protecting themselves from. She had Gerald loop back around the block. Mason was still at the car, crouching beside the passenger door with a small handheld device Charlotte didn't recognize, running it along the lower edge of the door panel. His daughter was still on the steps, reading something on a small tablet, unhurried and comfortable. Charlotte got out again. She told Mason she owed him a proper conversation, not just a check. He stood and looked at her for a moment with that same level expression, then said there was something she should probably know about her Bentley before she went anywhere. He walked to the front of the Bentley and, without asking permission, knelt beside the driver's side front wheel well. He reached up into the undercarriage and came back with something small between his thumb and forefinger, a device roughly the size and thickness of a coat button, matte black with a single embedded contact point. He held it up. Charlotte's legal background and her years in technology were more than enough for her to understand what she was looking at without being told. It was a tracking and data interception chip. It was broadcasting actively. And when Mason turned it over to show her the underside, there were 3 characters stamped into the polymer housing that she recognized immediately, the internal component code used exclusively by Meridian Dynamics' hardware procurement division. The chip had come from inside her own company. Charlotte stood on the sidewalk in the October light and processed the information with the controlled efficiency she applied to every crisis, but underneath that control something cold and urgent was moving. Whoever had placed that chip on her car had access to Meridian's component inventory. They had known her schedule, known her route, and had been tracking her movements, possibly for days. possibly for weeks. The accident, she suddenly understood, had not been an accident at all. The delivery truck that had drifted across the lane was already gone, vanished into the grid of the city. She had registered that detail and dismissed it. She didn't dismiss it now. Mason pocketed the chip in a small sealed sleeve, the kind used for electronic evidence preservation. He had come prepared for this, or something like it. Charlotte looked at him, really looked at him, and revised everything she had assumed in the first 3 minutes of their encounter. Whatever Mason Carter was, he was not a relic, and he was not a victim. He was someone who had been watching, waiting, and already several steps ahead of a situation she was only now beginning to understand. They sat in the front seats of the Aston Martin, the city continuing around them with its usual indifference. The car's interior was clean in the way that a workspace is clean, not for appearances, but because precision requires order. The original leather was worn but intact. The gauges were analog, period correct, and entirely genuine. But behind the glove box, recessed beneath the armrest, and folded into the door panels were systems that had no business being inside a 60-year-old motor car: micro-optic cameras, a biometric lock sequence integrated into the ignition, an electromagnetic shielding layer built into the outer body panels, and a signal management unit that Mason had quietly described as a counterintelligence array. Charlotte asked him who had funded the build. He said he had built it himself, over 7 years, using components he had sourced through channels that no longer existed. The story he told her was not complete. He chose his words the way a careful man chooses which doors in his house to open for a stranger, but it was enough. 12 years ago, Mason had been the lead systems engineer on a classified automotive defense project contracted by a private security consortium. The project had been in its final development phase when it was compromised from within. Someone inside the team had sold the core architecture to a competing interest. The result was not simply corporate espionage, it was worse. A critical testing event had been sabotaged. 2 of Mason's colleagues were killed. The investigation that followed was inconclusive by design, the findings buried under layers of non-disclosure agreements, and the consortium dissolved the project and quietly settled with the families of the men who died. Mason had been cleared, but clearing him had required dismantling everything he had built there. He walked away from the industry entirely, took his daughter, she had been less than 2 years old at the time, and relocated quietly. His wife had died 8 months after the sabotage, in circumstances that Mason described as a road accident, but that the look on his face when he said it made clear were something he had never fully accepted as accidental. He had built the modified DB5 not as a showpiece and not as a weapon, but as a private insurance policy, a system that, if the people responsible for destroying his former life ever came back into range, would give him the means to document, to verify, and to protect what remained. Charlotte listened without interrupting. The professional in her was cataloging every detail, the technical specifics, the timeline, the names he didn't say. The part of her that had been quietly growing less comfortable since the moment she saw the dashboard display was doing something harder to categorize. It was reassessing the morning, reassessing the past year, reassessing the assumption she had lived with since founding Meridian Dynamics, that she understood the landscape she was operating in. The system in the DB5 had flagged something new while they were talking. Mason checked the display with the focused attention of someone reading a heartbeat monitor. An unauthorized access attempt had been made on the encrypted communications layer of Meridian's primary server during the past 40 minutes. The intrusion had been clean, surgical, and had been routed through a proxy architecture designed to look like routine maintenance traffic. Charlotte's own security team had not triggered an alert. Mason's car had. He pulled up the trace on the mirror display and walked her through the signature, the specific packet structure, the timing intervals, the authentication bypass method. Charlotte recognized the vulnerability being exploited. It was one that Meridian's internal security team had flagged for patching 7 months ago, delayed at the instruction of the board's Technology Oversight Committee, pending a review that had never concluded. At the bottom of the access log, flagged in amber by the DB5 system, was a user identifier. It was not a real user account, it was a construct, a ghost credential assembled from fragments of legitimate accounts in Meridian's directory. But the construction method left a fingerprint, and Mason's system had matched that fingerprint to a source it had encountered before. He said the name without inflection, as though announcing a weather condition. Jason Hunter. Charlotte knew the name. Everyone in the autonomous vehicle industry knew the name. Jason Hunter ran Helios Automotive Intelligence, a competitor that had been shadowing Meridian for 3 years, matching product announcements almost point for point, responding to Meridian's patent filings with preemptive applications that sometimes arrived within days. The industry had chalked it up to parallel development, to the natural convergence that happens when multiple teams chase the same technical horizon. Charlotte had always found it irritating. She was now understanding it as something else entirely. She asked Mason what Hunter's connection was to the project he had described, the classified program, the sabotage, the fire that had consumed his former career. Mason was quiet for a long moment. He said Hunter had not been part of the project directly. He had been a procurement consultant with access to the consortium's vendor relationships, a peripheral figure who had known enough to be dangerous and had been careful enough, for years, to remain invisible. He said he had suspected Hunter for a long time, but suspicion without evidence was something he had learned, at great cost, to treat with patience. What was in the DB5 system was evidence. Charlotte Madison was not accustomed to asking anyone for help. That was not arrogance in the conventional sense, it was a discipline, one she had developed over years of watching what happened to people in her position when they showed uncertainty to the wrong audience. The technology industry rewarded confidence the way water rewards the lowest point. It flowed there naturally, and everything else followed. She had built her reputation on the appearance of having already solved whatever problem was in front of her, even when she was solving it in real time. The idea of sitting in a vintage car in Midtown Manhattan and asking a man she had met 45 minutes ago to help her save her company from a threat she hadn't known existed an hour before was, by any measure she normally applied, an unacceptable situation. She did it anyway. She told Mason that she needed his help. She said it cleanly, without qualifications, without the kind of framing she would normally use to make a request sound like a proposition. He listened, and he didn't say yes immediately, and he didn't perform reluctance to extract concessions. He looked out through the windshield for a moment, at the city doing what the city does, moving, grinding, indifferent, and then he said he had 2 conditions. The first was that his daughter was not to be involved, mentioned, or brought into proximity with whatever was about to happen. The second was that Charlotte followed his instructions without negotiation when timing required it. He said he understood that was difficult for her. She didn't argue with the characterization. They spent the next hour inside the DB5, working through the data Mason's system had assembled. The picture that emerged was precise and, once visible, strikingly obvious in retrospect, which is the characteristic of a well-executed deception. Jason Hunter had not simply been stealing technology. He had been constructing a scenario. The noon signing ceremony was the centerpiece of that scenario. During the live demonstration segment, the portion where Charlotte's engineering team would show the autonomous vehicle system performing a complex urban navigation sequence, Hunter intended to activate a corrupted version of Meridian's core guidance algorithm that his team had spent months building from stolen specifications. The corrupted version would not simply fail. It would fail in a way that produced erratic, dangerous behavior, and it would fail in a way that looked exactly like Meridian's own technology making catastrophic decisions. The partners who were there to sign a $1.4 billion agreement would watch Charlotte's autonomous vehicle system veer off course, accelerate inappropriately, and ignore override commands. Their lawyers would advise them to walk away. The regulatory agencies that Hunter had quietly pre-briefed would open emergency safety investigations. Meridian Dynamics would not recover from the combination. Hunter had designed it to look like a product defect caused by rushed development and inadequate testing, exactly the narrative that Meridian's critics had been building toward for months, now supplied with genuine-looking technical evidence and a catastrophic live demonstration to seal it. Charlotte sat with that information and let herself feel, very briefly, the full weight of how close she had come to not knowing any of this. She looked across at Mason, who was now cross-referencing signal data on the display with the focused calm of someone diffusing something in his sleep, and she understood for the first time something about what genuine competence looked like when it wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't building a case for his own importance. He was simply working the problem, the way a person works a problem when they have already paid the full cost of underestimating it and have decided not to do so again. Charlotte had surrounded herself with intelligent people for 9 years, engineers, lawyers, strategists, analysts, but she had selected them in part for their loyalty, their legibility, their willingness to operate within structures she controlled. Mason operated outside every structure she had ever built. He was not threatened by her position and he was not attracted to it. He was simply there, solving a problem that mattered, because he had decided it mattered. The signing ceremony was held in the grand conference suite of the Meridian Dynamics Tower on 6th Avenue, 22 stories up, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the kind of room designed to communicate that the company inside it had already won whatever contest was being run. 112 guests had assembled by 11:45, automotive executives, institutional investors, members of the technology press, 2 congressmen whose committees oversaw transportation infrastructure, and a scattering of industry analysts who had written extensively about whether Meridian's latest system was genuinely ready for commercial deployment. Jason Hunter had arrived at 11:15, offering Charlotte a handshake and a practiced smile that conveyed admiration for her work and confidence in the afternoon's outcome. She returned the smile with the same professional warmth and said nothing that mattered. Charlotte had made one visible change to the morning's plan. She had arrived in the Aston Martin DB5. Gerald drove the Bentley separately. Masons had parked the DB5 in the loading area beneath the building, connected to the tower's network through a physical access point that Charlotte's IT manager, one of 3 people in the building she trusted completely after the morning's revelations, had prepared under the pretext of a routine infrastructure check. A few people on the sidewalk noticed the old car pulling into the loading bay and said something to a companion in the way city people comment on oddities. Briefly, without commitment, the demonstration was scheduled to begin at 12:15. Charlotte's lead engineer, a composed woman named Dr. Patricia Solis, ran the pre-show briefing with characteristic precision, walking the assembled guests through the architecture of the city navigation test, the safety verification protocols, and the metrics they would see on the overhead displays during the live run. The room was attentive and cautiously optimistic. 3 of the automotive partners had already signaled through their legal teams that morning that they were prepared to sign, barring any unforeseen issues with the demonstration. Jason Hunter sat in the 3rd row with 2 associates, his expression one of courteous interest. At 12:17, the demonstration feed went live on the 6 overhead screens. The autonomous vehicle, a modified sedan carrying sensor arrays and running Meridian's proprietary guidance system, began its route through a simulated urban grid in the company's New Jersey testing facility, transmitted live to the conference room. For the first 90 seconds, the performance was textbook: clean lane discipline, appropriate yielding behavior at intersections, precise response to a pedestrian simulation at a crosswalk. The room began to relax into approval. At 12:19 and 40 seconds, the vehicle's behavior changed. It drifted past a stop point without decelerating. It misclassified a static obstacle and steered toward it before correcting late. It stopped responding to remote override commands from the monitoring station for a period of 11 seconds, during which it was traveling at 32 miles per hour through a residential zone simulation. The overhead displays filled with cascading error notifications. The room went quiet with the particular quality of silence that precedes serious professional consequences. Dr. Solis was at the monitoring station, her expression locked in controlled alarm, her hands moving over the console in ways that were not producing results. Jason Hunter allowed himself approximately 2 seconds of visible concern before composing his features into the expression of a man who had always privately harbored doubts and was now, regrettably, being proven right. Below the building, Mason was already working. The moment the first anomalous input had appeared in the vehicle's guidance stream, 48 seconds before it manifested on screen, the DB5 system had flagged the intrusion signature and Mason had engaged the counter protocol he had spent the previous 3 hours calibrating to Meridian's specific network architecture. The DB5 sent a directional jamming pulse across the frequency band Hunter's team was using to push the corrupted algorithm into Meridian's feed. The corrupted stream was cut. The vehicle's native guidance system reasserted control. But the more critical function was already running in parallel. Mason's system had been logging every packet of Hunter's intrusion, timestamping it, signing it with cryptographic verification, and routing the complete file with source identification to the 6 overhead screens in the conference room. The cascade of error messages was replaced, without transition, by a clean technical display showing the intrusion pathway in full detail, the entry point, the corrupted payload, the destination address within Meridian system, and, clearly labeled, source verified, and impossible to misread, the originating server registered to Helios Automotive Intelligence and authorized under the corporate account of Jason Hunter. The room absorbed this in silence for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it became something else entirely. One of the automotive executives stood. A congressman's aide was on the phone. Hunter's 2 associates were already moving toward the exit. Hunter himself sat very still in the 3rd row, and for the first time since Charlotte had known him by reputation, his expression was not performing anything at all. It was simply the face of a man watching a structure he had built over years collapse in under 60 seconds. Charlotte stood at the front of the room and said nothing while the room processed what it had seen. Dr. Solis confirmed from the monitoring station that the vehicle was operating normally, that the genuine guidance system had never been at fault, and that the data on the overhead screens was consistent with a sophisticated external intrusion attempt that had been interdicted and logged in real time. She had not looked at Hunter since the display changed. She didn't need to. The aftermath of the signing ceremony was organized and deliberate. Statements were made. Legal holds were issued. The corporate partners signed their agreements before leaving. But Jason Hunter was not in the building when the police arrived. He had moved through the evacuation of the room with the practiced ease of someone who plans for the possibility of exits, and by the time Charlotte's security team reached the lobby, he was gone. The associates who had been with him were cooperative in the way people become cooperative when they understand that the alternative is worse, and what they shared with investigators in the following 2 hours confirmed the broad shape of what Mason had already assembled. But Hunter himself was mobile, had resources distributed across 3 jurisdictions, and had clearly anticipated that the afternoon might not conclude in his favor. Charlotte received the first call from her security director at 2:47, confirming that Hunter had not gone home, had not gone to his office, and had last been seen in a car heading uptown. The second call came from Mason, who was still in the loading bay running the DB5 systems, and who told her simply that she needed to come down and that she should leave her phone in her office before she did. She understood the instruction. She left the phone. They were on the West Side Highway within 15 minutes, the DB5 moving through mid-afternoon traffic with the particular anonymity of old vehicles in cities where old vehicles attract no surveillance. Mason had tracked Hunter's signal through a relay that Hunter's own device had been inadvertently feeding back through the counterintelligence array. It was, Mason explained without emphasis, a known vulnerability in the communication hardware Hunter preferred, one he had documented in his own files for several years without finding an occasion to use. He had that kind of patience. The car following them became apparent about 6 minutes north of the Lincoln Tunnel, a black SUV. 2 occupants, maintaining a spacing interval that was professionally precise. Mason had noted it before Charlotte spotted it, which she knew because his hands had shifted slightly on the steering wheel in a way she had already learned to read as preparation rather than tension. He didn't tell her to worry. He told her to hold the handle above the passenger door and to keep her feet flat on the floor. What happened next was not a chase in the cinematic sense, no running red lights, no pedestrian scattering. It was more precise than that, and more deliberate. Mason released a thermal misting system through the rear quarter vents of the DB5, a fine dispersal that confused optical sensors and created a diffuse visual screen at a range of about 40 meters. He turned onto the ramp for the Cross Bronx without signaling. In the tunnel section beneath the interchange, where ambient sensor coverage was limited, he activated the car's electromagnetic interference overlay, a localized field that scrambled incoming tracking signals across a 12-meter radius and made the DB5, for the purposes of any system trying to follow a radio or GPS signature, effectively disappear. The SUV came through the mist on the wrong lane of the interchange. By the time it had reoriented, the DB5 was 3 turns away and running parallel to the original pursuit vector, not ahead of it. Charlotte let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 45 seconds. Mason said that Hunter's team were professionals but that they were operating reactively, which meant they were always responding to what had just happened rather than anticipating what was about to. He said that was the fundamental asymmetry they were working with, and that they needed to use it before Hunter re-established control of the situation. Hunter had sent the pursuit, Mason explained, not to harm them directly, not yet, but to locate something. Hunter knew the DB5 existed, had known about the prototype from the original project 12 years ago, had known it was unaccounted for, and had spent years assuming it had either been destroyed or stored somewhere inaccessible. Finding it operational and capable of dismantling a year's worth of careful preparation in under 60 seconds had changed his calculation entirely. He wasn't running from the law yet. He was running towards something he needed to destroy before the law caught up. Charlotte sat in the passenger seat of the old gray Aston Martin as it moved through the Bronx in the clear October afternoon, and she thought about the version of herself that had stepped out of the Bentley that morning to hand a check to a man she had already categorized and dismissed. She thought about the version of Mason Carter she had constructed in that first minute, the modest car, the worn jacket, the child on the brownstone steps, and she understood, with a clarity that embarrassed her, how completely wrong she had been in every assumption. Not because the assumptions were unusual, because they were exactly the kind of assumptions she had built her entire professional methodology on: fast assessment, confident categorization, decisive action. They were useful tools in the correct context. She had been operating in the wrong context for a very long time. She found out about the wife not from Mason but from Patricia Solis, who had been quiet throughout the afternoon's chaos and who caught Charlotte alone in the corridor outside the legal team's briefing room at 4:15. Patricia had been with Meridian for 5 years and had come out of a defense contractor background that Charlotte had always found useful without fully investigating. Patricia said, quietly and without preamble, that she had recognized Mason's name from a technical review committee she had served on 8 years ago, a post-incident panel convened to assess the safety failures in a classified vehicular defense program. She said she had not known he was still active. She said she was sorry for what had happened to his wife. The details were spare in the way that classified incident details are spare, the summary without the substance, the what without the why. The accident had occurred on a highway outside Richmond, Virginia. The vehicle involved had experienced a catastrophic guidance failure of the kind that, in the context of what Charlotte now knew about Jason Hunter and his methods, was indistinguishable from deliberate interference. The investigation had attributed the failure to a manufacturing defect in a steering component. The component supplier had settled quietly. The file had been closed. Mason had been 300 miles away when it happened, had received the call in the middle of a debrief, and had been told by the consortium's legal team within 24 hours that he was not to speak about the incident to anyone outside an approved channel. Charlotte stood in the corridor with that information and let it settle. She thought about the way Mason moved through a crisis: no excess motion, no wasted energy, no performance of anything. She thought about his daughter on the brownstone steps, reading her tablet with the calm concentration of a child who has been taught, by long practice, not to expect the world to come to her and not to be disturbed when it doesn't. She thought about the 7 years Mason had spent building a system that only he could fully account for, using his own funds, his own knowledge, his own patience, for a purpose that he had never explained to anyone and had never needed to. She had walked into that morning with $1.4 billion in partnership agreements on the table and an unbroken record of having determined the value of every situation she entered before she entered it. She had been wrong about everything that actually mattered. When she reached Mason at the car, she asked him to tell her what Hunter was running toward. He said it was a decommissioned manufacturing facility in the industrial corridor north of the Harlem River, a site that had been part of the original consortium's infrastructure 12 years ago, that had changed hands twice since the project dissolved and was now technically owned by a shell company whose ultimate beneficial owner, traced through 4 layers of incorporation, was a fund managed by a board that included Jason Hunter. Charlotte asked what Hunter was keeping there. Mason said the last complete archive of the sabotage project's core data, not a copy, not a derivative. The original. He said Hunter had kept it for 12 years not because he used it regularly, but because the day might come when its existence gave him leverage over someone who couldn't afford to let it surface. Charlotte asked why Mason had never gone after it before. He said that going after it before tonight would have meant being the one who surfaced the evidence without a witness, without a legal record, without a context that made the whole picture visible rather than just the parts that looked bad for him. He said he had learned what happened to people who exposed things before the world was ready to understand what was being exposed. Tonight was different. Tonight there was a record, a room full of witnesses, a legal chain of custody. and a corporate sabotage attempt already in the hands of federal investigators. Tonight, going after the archive meant finishing something instead of just surviving it. The facility was exactly what it looked like from the outside, abandoned, maintained just enough to prevent liability without suggesting occupation. A corrugated metal structure covering approximately 40,000 square feet, sitting behind a chain-link perimeter in a strip of light industrial land that the city's development plans had forgotten. The access gate was locked with hardware that had been replaced within the past 18 months, new padlock on an old chain, which told Mason everything he needed to know about the facility's active use. He cut the DB5's engine 3 blocks out and coasted to a stop beneath a broken streetlight. He spent 4 minutes running a passive sensor sweep from the car, thermal imaging, signal density mapping, motion detection across the perimeter, before he said anything. He told Charlotte there were 4 individuals inside, 2 stationed near the northeast corner, 2 near what the building's original schematic identified as the main server room. Hunter was there. The heat signature was consistent with someone working at a terminal, not waiting. They entered through a loading dock on the south face of the building, accessing a mechanical override panel that Mason had memorized from the original facility documentation he had retained for exactly this reason. The interior smelled of concrete dust and old lubricant, the air still and cold in the way of large spaces that have been sealed against the weather. The overhead fluorescents were partially powered, casting strips of flat white light across the floor at intervals, with long stretches of shadow between. They moved through the shadow. Mason navigated without hesitation or reference to any device, which told Charlotte he had been here before, not recently, but often enough in memory that the space was still mapped inside him with precision. They found Hunter in the server room. He was standing at a terminal running hardware that had been cutting edge 12 years ago and had since been superseded by several generations of development. The server architecture around him was the original project infrastructure, physical units, not virtualized, because the data they held was too sensitive to have ever been migrated to anything connected to an external network. Hunter heard them enter, turned, and did not appear surprised. He looked at Mason with the particular expression of someone who has been anticipating a confrontation for a very long time and has constructed, in the interval, a version of it that he believes he controls. He said he had wondered how long it would take Mason to come here. He said the afternoon's events had been unfortunate but ultimately a minor disruption in a longer process. He said the data in the room behind him was enough to rebuild everything, to start again under different cover, with different partners, and that Mason could report what he liked to whoever would listen, because the original evidence of what had happened 12 years ago was stored in a format that only Hunter's specific decryption key could access, on hardware that would wipe itself clean at the first sign of unauthorized access. He said it with confidence, because that was how he had designed it, and for 12 years it had been sufficient. Mason said nothing for a moment. Then he said Hunter was thinking about the wrong system. Hunter's expression shifted, not to panic, but to the focused recalculation of an intelligent person who has just registered that a variable they excluded from their model was not actually absent. Mason touched the inside panel of the DB5's detachable control module, which he had carried in on a shoulder mount, and the server room's display units, all 6 screens arrayed across 2 walls, activated and began showing data. Not the data Hunter had been protecting. The data Mason had been assembling for 12 years, the communications logs, the equipment procurement records, the maintenance access timestamps, the signal anomalies from the night of the accident in Virginia, the financial transfers, the shell company trails. All of it signed, verified, dated, and already transmitting. The DB5 system had been broadcasting via encrypted satellite relay since they entered the building. The full archive was not going to a hard drive somewhere. It was going to the offices of 3 federal agencies, the legal teams of every corporate partner who had been in the signing ceremony that afternoon, and 4 investigative journalists whose contact information Mason had kept current for 11 years. Hunter looked at the screens. He looked at Mason. He looked at the door, and found Charlotte standing in it. He reached for the manual wipe switch on the server housing, a physical failsafe, hardwired, designed to bypass any software interlock. Mason had anticipated this also. The DB5's electromagnetic shielding pulse, deployed at short range directly through the control module, induced a current spike in the facility's wiring that tripped the building's main circuit breaker before Hunter's hand reached the switch. The room went dark for approximately 2 seconds, and when the emergency lighting came up battery-backed, on a separate circuit, Hunter was standing in the same position, the wipe switch untouched, and the transmission was complete. Charlotte had recorded every word spoken in the server room through the audio capture integrated into Mason's control module. The recording was already embedded in the archive. Hunter's voice, Hunter's words, Hunter's acknowledgement of what the data contained, all of it was in the hands of people who would know what to do with it by morning. Hunter sat down, finally, in the chair beside the terminal. He didn't speak again. Federal investigators arrived at the facility 41 minutes later. Mason waited by the DB5 in the parking area outside, and did not go back in. 3 weeks after the night at the facility, Charlotte stood in front of Meridian's full board of directors and gave an account that was honest in a way her boardroom presentations had never been. She told them what had happened at the signing, what she had found on her car, what she had not known about her own company's security vulnerabilities, and which members of the board had been in communication with Hunter's associates over the preceding 18 months. 2 of those members resigned before the meeting ended. The third was referred to the company's legal counsel. Charlotte did not soften the account or frame it strategically. She simply said what was true, and let the room absorb it. She called Mason the following Monday. He answered on the 3rd ring, and she could hear his daughter in the background asking something about a school project. Charlotte told him she wanted to apologize properly, which she did, not with the efficient brevity of a professional transaction, but with the directness of someone acknowledging a specific wrong. She said she had looked at him on 48th Street and seen what she expected to see rather than what was there, and that the gap between those 2 things had nearly cost her everything. He said he appreciated it. He didn't say it was nothing, because it wasn't, and he was not the kind of man who said things for social ease. She made him an offer. Meridian Dynamics would license the defensive system architecture that Mason had developed, under terms that he specified, with his name on the patent, his approval required for any deployment, and a compensation structure that reflected the actual value of what he had built rather than the depreciated estimate of what it looked like from the outside. She told him the figure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would think about it. He came back to her 3 days later with a counter-proposal that was not about money. He said he would agree to a consulting arrangement, not a licensing deal, not an acquisition, under conditions that kept the technology under his authority and restricted its application to safety and protection rather than commercial tracking or enforcement use. He said he had built the system to protect people, and that was the only context in which he was willing to see it used. Charlotte agreed without negotiation. It was the first business agreement she had entered in 9 years without trying to shift the terms in her favor, and the absence of that instinct told her something about how the past few weeks had altered her calibration. Meridian Dynamics changed in the months that followed, in ways that were not always visible from outside but were felt throughout the company. Charlotte restructured the Technology Oversight Committee, replacing the members who had served primarily as levers for the board's financial interests with engineers and ethicists who understood what the technology they were overseeing actually did. She commissioned an independent security audit and published the findings without editing. She declined 2 acquisition approaches from funds with connections to the kind of investment architecture that Hunter had used, citing ethical concerns in terms specific enough that the industry understood exactly what she was communicating. Mason did not become a public figure. He consulted on 3 projects over the following year, each time on his own terms, each time leaving when the work was done without taking more credit than was accurate and without accepting recognition that turned a person into a brand. His daughter won her school's science fair that spring with a project on electromagnetic shielding in consumer vehicle design. He attended the presentation in a folding chair in the school gymnasium and watched her explain her work to a panel of judges with the same measured precision she had inherited from him. And he was, by every visible measure, exactly where he wanted to be. The Aston Martin DB5 remained parked outside the brownstone on 48th Street, its exterior as weathered and unremarkable as it had always been. Charlotte drove past it once, in her own car, on a morning when she was running 10 minutes early for a meeting, which still happened, because some things don't change. She slowed as she passed it. The gray paint caught the morning light in a way that made it look, for a moment, like something important that had been left in plain sight for people to notice if they were paying attention. Most people weren't. That, Charlotte had come to understand, was precisely the point. The most capable things in the world rarely advertise themselves. They simply work, quietly and completely, and wait to be understood by the people who are finally looking at what is actually there.